All right, everyone, thank you so much. So today I have the distinct honor of introducing Mr. Ken Blackwell. Mr. Blackwell has a distinguished past in the conservative movement, having served as the mayor of Cincinnati, the Ohio State Treasurer, and the Ohio Secretary of State, and also as the U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations Commission on Human Rights. Not only a politician, Blackwell is also the author of 3 books, Rebuilding America, The Blueprint, and Resurgent. He is also recognized as a Senior Fellow for Human Rights and Constitutional Governance at the Family Research Council. Blackwell has received many awards and honors for his work in the public sector. These accolades include the U.S. Department of State's Superior Honor Award for his work in the field of human rights, which he received from both the administrations of President George H.W. Bush and Bill Clinton. In 2004, the American Conservative Union honored Mr. Blackwell with the John M. Ashbrook Award for his steadfast conservative leadership. In 1992, he received Xavier University's Distinguished Alumnus Award and was inducted into Xavier's Athletic Hall of Fame in 2015. Ken's commentaries have been published in major newspapers and websites: The Wall Street Journal, USA Today, The New York Times, The Washington Post, The Washington Times, and Investor's Business Daily. In addition, he has been interviewed by many media outlets, including CBS's Face the Nation, NBC's Meet the Press, ABC's This Week, and Fox News Sunday. We are absolutely honored to have someone with us today that has done so much work for the conservative movement, and I personally can't wait to hear from him. Please help me welcome Mr. Ken Blackwell to the stage.
Thank you very much for that more than generous introduction. I only wish my mom could have heard it. She would have believed every word of it, God bless her. I'm glad that I got here 15 minutes early to hear the tail end of the last presentation and series of interactions. It was most enlightening. I only wish I could have heard from group 7 and 8. While I was sitting there, I was thinking, listening to the concepts that were articulated from the worksheets and the leaders of the various groups, listening to Ron sum them up, amplify others. I was wondering what the heck I was doing here. I was trying to think of myself perhaps as one of the background singers to Aretha Franklin, saying, what am I adding to this song? You all touched on the themes, the concepts, those things that have made us an exceptional nation. But one of the things that was underscored as I listened to you interact with Ron was a notion that Ronald Reagan shared with us when he said that America's exceptionalism and the freedoms that we enjoy are just a generation away from extinction, meaning that these things do not exist, do not last in practice unattended to. That each generation must renew our nation's commitment to those underlying principles, concepts, and the constitutional framework which embraces them. Hebrews 12, verse 1, tells us that there are a cloud of witnesses watching how we run the race that has been marked for us. That is the challenge of your generation. There are a cloud of witnesses from our nation's founders and all of the folks who have worked and toiled and championed the ideas that have made us an exceptional nation, but who have passed on, they form that cloud of witnesses that are watching how your generation runs the race marked for you all. To hear in your interactions your understanding of the primacy of the family. To hear in your worksheets reflections of your understanding of the centrality of God in the life of our nation was not only promising and encouraging, but uplifting. And so before I share with you my thoughts, I want to thank you for the little bit I heard of your interactions and the notions that you have embraced. Because I've had an opportunity to travel to over 60 countries in our world, about just a little bit under a third of all the nations in the United Nations, I've come to appreciate in my study and in my observations of nations and how they are governed or not governed, that authoritarian governments, totalitarian states have a consistent two actions to maintain their power. They silence the church and they destroy the family. The family is the incubator of liberty. I heard that in one of your summaries in perhaps different words, but the principle was there. Families are the incubators of liberty. And therefore, authoritarian, or big welfare state governments must destroy the family, and they must drive God and faith out of the public square. That second paragraph of the Declaration of Independence, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they're endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. My dad, who was a high school graduate, blue-collar worker, an Army grunt, used to always say to me and my brother that when you talk about we hold these truths to be self-evident, he used to say, that's a highfalutin way of saying any idiot should be able to get this. That we are all created equal. We're not all equal in height and weight and intelligence, wealth, but we're all equal in the human dignity that God has invested in each and every one of us. I heard in their closing and summary remarks something that captures that next phrase, or the phrase in that paragraph. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they're endowed by their Creator, which means that those rights that we have are not grants from any government. They're gifts from God. And that governments only have one responsibility, and that is to protect those fundamental rights. And captured in that paragraph, and the following paragraph, which says that when government fails to do that, we have an obligation to reform or overthrow that government, because it is a direct assault on that which has given us a distinguishable character from any other government in all of human history that came before us. And that we, in our example, are a shining light of freedom. And it is so important to the American character that we embrace that, understand it, and live it. Which means that we should not pass through today without reflecting on the assault on innocence that took place in New Zealand, where 40 people or more who were worshiping were assaulted. We cannot become adherents to the ideology of relativism. We basically have to believe that there are fundamental rights, universal rights, that are given to all of God's creations across the globe. And that those rights must be respected. That doesn't mean that everybody has a right to invade our borders. Doesn't mean that everyone has a right to disregard our laws if they feel so inclined. But it does mean that all peoples of the world have been given a set of fundamental rights reflected in their human dignity. And I think that the obligation as Americans in America is that this generation, your generation, must first understand what has made us the greatest country in all of human history, the most prosperous, and the most democratic in our Republican form of government, again, in all of human history. But if there's nothing else that you take from my remarks today, I want you to appreciate the importance of family. I'm going to ask you a question. How many of you have ever heard the name D. Hart Hubbard? Oh, we got somebody back there that's heard of D. Hart Hubbard. I'll ask you to hold on to it and make sure that it's the same D. Hart Hubbard. D. Hart Hubbard was my great uncle. D. Hart Hubbard, in 1924, in the Olympic Games in Paris, became the first Black American to win an Olympic gold medal in track and field. He, in 24, was supposed to run against Eric Liddell. How many of y'all have heard of Eric Liddell? He and Eric Liddell had a transatlantic debate as to which one of them was the fastest human being on the face of the earth. And they were going to resolve it in Paris. My uncle had qualified for 3 events: the 100, the high hurdles, and the long jump. When he got to Paris, he was told that the 100 and the high hurdles were white-only events, and he couldn't compete. But as you know, Eric Liddell chose not to compete in the finals because it fell on the Sabbath. So when my uncle came back after setting the world record in the long jump and bringing home his gold medal, he said that more important than that gold medal was a principle, a concept, a notion that he had witnessed firsthand that was more important, more valuable to him in his life than that gold medal that he won in the long jump. He said that he witnessed a man who was willing to forego worldly glory to embrace fidelity of faith. And fidelity of faith became a watchword in my family, a phrase that basically, when you begin to understand just the strength of faith in your life, in the public square, you begin to appreciate what has distinguished us for over 241 years from the rest of the nation. But you also understand what is important for your generation to fight to protect. And that is the fact that God lives in the life of our nation, and that we all have a fundamental right to practice our religion, not just within the four walls of the church, but in the public square. The destruction of the family and the attempt to run faith in God out of the public square, these are forces that are alive and well within our society today. Martin Luther King, in an address in 1961 at Lincoln University, had a line that underscores what I want you to embrace. He said, "We are all heirs to the legacy of worthiness." We are all heirs to the worthiness, to the legacy of worthiness. What Martin Luther King understood as he was right in the middle of the civil rights battle was that we must be on the front lines in the struggle between moral relativism and the universal absolute principles that are in play in our lives. If, in fact, relativism wins, then statism wins. Because what the state says goes, goes, and what the state says is worthy, versus a concept that turned old-fashioned governance of the power of kings and the power of the state on its head, when it basically said that the individual is, in fact, with his or her free will, within the framework of decency, you are the architects of your futures, not the state. Because the state will pick and choose. The state will pick winners and losers based on gender, based on race, based on, you give it. You name it, the state can pick and choose. But when you embrace, as we embrace, the dignity of all, you then begin to understand that it is the power of the individual, the power of freedom, that triumphs over all forms of authoritarianism, totalitarianism, and welfare state big brotherism. What I wanted to do today is to just lay that out. And when I walked into the room, I said, how can I lay it out? They've already embraced it. They have already articulated it. I can only create an opportunity for us to expand on it. And in this moment, I will give Group 7 and 8 the opportunity to engage first. But we are living at a time when the expansion of centralized government is, in fact, a threat to our individual freedom. So let me stop. Let me ask if there are groups from 7 and 8, go to your memory bank, your chart, anything that I've said that was stimulated or incubated in your discussion, let's expand on it now.
You don't mind, raising your hand, and I will chase down the microphone to you. Even if you're not in group 7 or 8, we're going to open it up for Q&A. And just remember to say your name and school.
Hello. Oh, wow, that's loud. My name is Mason Strand from Canyon High School. My question is over the values of family. What can we expect? How can we expound on these values? As we know, a lot of dictatorships, especially the Soviet Union, they attempted to create their own family through youth groups, and we're trying to expound upon the welfare state and the level of hierarchy in the state.
Thank you, sir. Let me underscore a notion that I've come to appreciate in my 71 years. Traditions are stories that families write together. That ties into my whole notion that families are the incubator of liberty. So in answering your question, how can we push back? We have to begin to know that human relationships are very fragile. They take work to maintain. Families sometimes take a lot of work to maintain. But society in general has, with no-fault divorce, or abortion on demand. These are the notions of expediency for those forces that want to destroy the family and therefore create a dependency on the state by the individual, giving power to the state. So it's just simple things of pushing back, keeping families together, choosing life over death, struggle. I think about the whole term struggle. About 20 years ago, I had a radical prostatectomy, and I was coming out of recovery. And I saw the little dot on the machine going up and down. Beep, beep, beep. I said, thank God I didn't see a flat line. But in fact, that image stuck with me. What it taught me and what it brought home to me is a notion that I had been taught all my life. That life is about peaks and valleys. Human relationships often are about peaks and valleys. But the God that is with us at the mountaintop is also the God that is with us in the valley. And that's why faith is such an important pushback and counterbalance to this whole notion that is geared towards destroying the family, destroying the incubator of liberty. We just have to work at it. We have to understand that it wouldn't be, we wouldn't be human if every relationship was perfect. But we can't just dismiss it. I was out in California. I wasn't in this area, but I was in a vineyard, and on the wall of this winemaker was a saying: "If there is no struggle on the vine, there is no character in the fruit." So we have to start with understanding that as we live our lives, God has put us in struggle. It's not a flatline experience. I don't know any human being that just had all mountaintop experiences if they lived any amount of time. So my answer is simple. We have to struggle. We have to struggle against the forces that want to destroy the family. We have to, in fact, struggle with the ups and downs of relationships within the family. But struggle. It builds character, it holds families together, and it breeds liberty.
Mine's not really a question. I think it's really just an add-on to what we were talking about before.
That's great.
And I'm Nicholas Sanker from the Covenant School, junior there in Charlottesville, Virginia. And one big theme that I really noticed here at this conference is that a very important thing for the conservatives is their freedom and rights. But one really big thing that I've noticed also is a lot of times people say with great freedom comes great responsibility. And I don't think we emphasized that enough in what we talked about. And one really big thing is just the personal responsibility that comes with it. And that is such a big deal. And like what you said with family, and I think that we need to really embrace the accountability and the responsibility that we have as people in this country to hold each other accountable and to really embrace the family unit in the communities that we have. And so in order to embrace the freedom that we have, we need to have the responsibility to embrace furthering ourselves and furthering everybody around us in community and in our families.
Thank you, sir. Let me sort of let me tie into that, taking the risk of responsibility. Sometimes the great escape is to say, "Oh, I'm not responsible for that," or the state or the system can take care of this. I have no responsibility. When I was doing my master's degree work, I read about the antebellum South and the institution of slavery, and it was something that struck me, and it's all about the risk. And we can't, as individuals, lose our risk orientation. But as this psychiatrist was laying out in the article that I was reading about, it said that when African slaves were captured on the continent of Africa and brought to the United States, they had to be chained and beaten, and in some cases killed. They had to be guarded because there was this natural human instinct to flee captivity, to move away from this sort of sense of hopelessness. But it was only when these captives could have the guards removed, the chains removed, and no direct force applied, that they still stayed within their area of prescription, that was when slavery had completed its mission, because they had been captives before. Now they were self-fulfilling slaves. And I went on to read more into this article, and he says that all of us, you, me, we there's a psychological state. It's called homeostasis, which all is a fancy way of saying equilibrium. We don't like to be out of balance. We like balance. We like stability. And so there are times when we accept things that we instinctively know is wrong, or things that are wrong, because we don't want to take the risk of change, of challenging the status quo. And that's what has happened to too many of us, that we have become so comfortable, so driven by this notion of homeostasis, that we don't take the risk of freedom. We don't challenge a dysfunctional status quo. We find comfort. And so, let me just expand on what you just said. We have to be willing to take the risk of change. We have to know when the status quo is stale. He didn't say it this way directly, he said it in another, but Ronald Reagan told us that there's no victory in the status quo. And that's the challenge of your generation. There's no victory in the status quo. You have to be agents for change. And in this case, change means going back to those universal concepts that have made us the most prosperous democratic nation on the face of the earth. Not the most perfect. We, in fact, as Lincoln said, we have not a perfect union, but a perfectible one. We can make it better, but we must understand what has made us the best, and we must conserve those positives. We can defend those positives. We can't defend slavery. That was cheating. But we can defend freedom and free markets and growth and constraint on the power of the state and optimizing individual liberty. Oh, you got it.
Want to make sure it's not too loud. So you talked about limiting. Oh, I'm Patrick Warren from Provo, Utah. You talked about how government is becoming more and more centralized. I feel like there's a difference between what we want in terms of personal liberty and what we are tolerating. That's right. And I think that for many decades now, conservatives were falling down a slippery slope, I guess. And currently the next drop on that slope is, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and her Green New Deal. And we're saying, oh, we need to stop this big thing, when really we've been falling down the slope for a while, and we don't need to stop that from happening. What we really need to do is reverse. We need to go back. We need to get freedoms back, not stop more from falling away, because for many decades they have been going away more and more. We have more taxes. We have more government influence in our lives. You have to have a permit or a license to, in many places, even build a fence in your yard. And I guess, when do we challenge the status quo, and how do we do it? Because I feel like we vote and we vote and we vote, and we're still going down the slippery slope. And so, are there other options that we should consider, like a national convention, or nullifying national law, as the states did a long, long time ago? I don't know. Do you understand?
To me, what you just said, just again, reinforces what I heard in some of the summaries that were already presented and what I tried to capitalize. It is at what point do we basically say, now Reagan did say this, the status quo is Latin for the mess that we're in. So if in fact you start embracing the status quo, you give meaning and life and energy to a dysfunctional status quo. So the question is, what needs to be done and where does it begin? It begins with me. It begins with you as the individual, basically saying that I'm going to do, look, one of the things that I've come to realize in 71 years is things that float with the current are normally dead. Only things that are alive and people who are alive can swim against the current. And that takes a little courage, but we individually have to be willing to take that risk to swim against the current.
Hi, I'm Jonas. I'm also from Charlottesville, Virginia. My question is, what are some current issues which highlight the importance of family values, and how can we as conservatives deal with these issues in reflection of the importance of the family?
Well, the current dilemma in a lot of families and a lot of individuals is that there are young men who are growing up without the example of a strong working male in their lives. That is a very big problem, and so some of this started, and I can just use the African American experience because I was there and and I watched it in my neighborhood. In the 50s and 60s, when I was growing up, there were more intact families than there are today. And there weren't as many civil liberties and freedoms being experienced in the 40s and 50s and 60s. But families stayed together. But once we created, with President Johnson's, big government initiative, we created this disincentive for families to stay intact and to struggle together. And we started to only reward those families that were without a working male, no matter how meager the income was, but was intact. We rewarded broken families. And one of the things that if you want more of something, all you have to do is subsidize it. And that whole notion has caught on. And so again, it's about the struggle. It's about commitment to one another. But you have to believe, that we can't become victim of this notion that if it feels good, do it, or if in fact it is hard, you can walk away. And human relationships are often hard. But the first thing that we can do, and it's easier to do in communities of faith, is to ask God to give you the strength to see more clearly and to persevere and to struggle through whatever rough waters might be affecting a relationship. That's what you can do. The other thing is, you can't make it easy to destroy life. You can't basically say unwantedness is a basis for taking innocent life. And if you look at the millions of kids that we've destroyed, that we've killed in the womb, and now some want to kill those kids outside of the womb, what's the consequence? We have almost a zero birth rate, and now we don't have the man and woman power to fill jobs that we need, to contribute to the intellectual development. All intellectual geniuses were not born of millionaire mothers and fathers. We are destroying ourselves by becoming a culture that destroys innocent life.
I'm Jamari. I'm from Los Angeles. I'll make my question brief. But so noting that you were previously the mayor of Cincinnati, you've seen inner cities and et cetera. And my question is, as an African American, how do we fix the struggle that we face within our community, within our cities? And do you think it's a social welfare program and it's kind of the government's, I don't want to say the government's fault, but the government's fault pushing these social welfare programs? Or do you think it's an individual thing and how we don't value as much in like our faith and, you know, a father being there? And if they tie hand in hand, and if so, how do we remedy that?
Well, one, it's a good question, but it's tied into what we're talking about. Governments can't solve this problem. There's not a government on the face of the earth that has made families stronger against the will of families. You know, so families and individuals first want to make it work, and then governments can only create environments that provide incentives for families to stay together as opposed to families separating. And as I said, with the Great Society program of Johnson, the incentive structure was to break up families or to destroy life. Look, my dad was a meat packer. He was a World War II veteran. He came back, and what he passed on to me and my brother were work ethics and a fundamental belief that, you know, governments don't make you wealthy or self-sufficient. Governments only breed dependencies, because by breeding dependency, governments become bigger and stronger. And if you believe what we said, and that is that governments can't give you your basic human rights through a grant. They can only create environments where your human rights are protected, and self-initiative and the possibility to do better can come from individual initiatives. That has worked, and that's what we have to do at the city level, the state level, and as a nation. Understand what has made us different.
Last question in the back.
I'm John Harding from Santa Cruz, California. I just wanted to ask you if you think that the degradation of families that we've seen in the last few decades is a result of a cultural shift or deliberate action on the part of the government?
That is a good question, and it's not either or. Men and women create culture, and then culture creates men and women. So what we have seen is that dynamic where the culture of big government has in fact influenced people to expect for government to do things that families have historically done for themselves. Decide about education, the role of religion in their lives, and what have you. Now government is in fact practicing big brotherism. Look, and this is a good way to sum it up. When my dad came back from World War II, he came back to Cincinnati. There was a housing shortage. There was still vestiges of segregation. And we lived in a public housing community called the Laurel Homes. But my dad always said that that was just a way station until we could break down the laws of segregation and that he could invest in a home. And while my dad, he died when he was 56, so he never owned his own home, but he implanted that sense of independence in the hearts of me and my brother. But I wanted to close on this story. He was a big boxing fanatic, and I boxed for the Finley Street neighborhood house. And I won my first 5 bouts. The sixth bout, I got hit so hard in the nose that I had to go home and tell my dad I was going to find a more scholarly career to pursue. And so I stayed away from boxing arenas until I was a freshman in college, when Father E.J. O'Connor, a senior Jesuit who was a Marine, took me and a Jewish classmate of mine, Benji Swartz, to the Golden Glove matches at the old Cincinnati Gardens. We watched about 10 fights. The 11th bout, young boy from the western side of Cincinnati, he too of Irish Catholic heritage, came out, and before his fight, he made the sign of the cross. Benji, again, who was Jewish, leaned over to Father and said, "Father, what's the significance of that?" Father said, "Well, if you want to understand the symbolic importance of it, come to my theology class. But for tonight, that ain't enough if he can't fight." And I would just suggest to you that we must be willing to put our faith into action. We must be willing to challenge the status quo. We must be champions for those things that have made us the most prosperous, the most democratic nation in all of human history. And this is our generational handoff to you all. And from what I've heard today, we're going to do better, and we're going to do just fine. Thank you very much.